Bio 2. We are going to continue on with chapter 27. We're going to do section 4 today, and this section is going to focus on mollusks. So this is another group of animals, probably our fifth by now. So in order to get started, we just have to look at what are the defining features of a mollusk. So what makes a mollusk a mollusk? So they are soft-bodied animals that usually have an internal or external shell. So that's going to be a big characteristic of this group, whether or not they have a shell. And these include things like snails, slugs, clams, squids, and octopi. So you've all heard of these before. And then many of them will share similar developmental stages. So that means a snail will develop the same way as a squid, which develops the same way as a clam, which develops the same way as a slug, which develops the same way as an octopus. And one big characteristic on how they development is something known as a trochophore. And this is a free swimming larval stage in the life cycle of a mollusk. And so that's just going to be very characteristic of this group. And this trochophore is found in annelids as well. And since they both share this similar early developmental stage, then we know that these two groups may be very closely related. And that's why we discuss them in the same chapter, because they have similar developmental stages. And then again, we talked about how that leads to showing that they were in fact very closely related, because early development is a big key in determining how things are related. And so now the form and function, how they're actually made up. So mollusks are groups that also have that column as well, and they also have complex interrelated organ systems that function together to maintain the body as a whole. So these actually do have some extremely complex organ systems that actually do work together that help them carry out essential bodily functions. And before we get to how they actually carry out those body functions, they actually have a very specific body plan. So actually how they're made up, that's very specific to this group. So we need to look at what that body plan is. And the body plan consists of 4 parts. And these parts are a foot, a mantle, a shell, and something that is known as a visceral mass. So we're going to talk about each one of those in depth. So our first one is the foot. So the muscular foot can take many forms. So the first form they could take is they could be a flat structure for crawling. So you can see that it's pink, and the pink part here is the snail. And they also have a spade-shaped structures for burrowing. So the clams have kind of a spade shape right here, and that's they used to burrow down in the sand and the silt and things like that. And the last one is their foot can actually take the form of tentacles for capturing prey. So if you look here on our squid, our pink area are these tentacles, and that's just their foot that has taken on many forms within this group. So that's very big defining characteristic of this group is their foot. And then the rest of it, the mantle, is just a thin layer of tissue that covers most of their mollusk's body. So the mantle is just kind of like their skin almost, if you would. And the shell is made by glands in the mantle that secrete calcium carbonate. So it's just a protective structure. Calcium carbonate is just a hard substance that makes it up. And just beneath the mantle is what's known as a visceral mass, and this is what's going to house the internal organs for our mollusks. So for feeding, so that's their body plan. So feeding, mollusks can be herbivores, carnivores, filter feeders, detrivores, or parasites, so they can fill a wide range. And some specific structures that will help them feed, and as one thing is called a radula, and that is found in snails and slugs, and it is a flexible tongue-shaped structure, and it contains hundreds of tiny teeth, and they use that to scrape algae off of rocks or to eat the soft tissue of plants. So you might not have known this, but a snail actually has a very weird kind of mouth-like feeding structure there. The radula, it's basically like a tongue with teeth on it, and that's how they feed. And clams and oysters and scallops, they all use gills, and so therefore their food is carried by water, which will enter through what's known as a in-current siphon. So in-current just means that it flows in, so they have 2 kind of parts of the siphon, and it's just a tube-like structure through which water enters and leaves the body. So siphon is a big characteristic of this group as well. It's a tube-like structure through which water will enter and leave their body. And then the water will flow over the gills, and it leaves by the excurrent siphon. So if you can see here, this picture makes a lot of sense. We have the blue arrow pointing in. In-current just means it's taking the water in, and then it flows back out through the excurrent siphon. So that's just how they pull water in order to feed. And then in order to breathe, a lot of mollusks would breathe using gills inside of their mantle cavity. So gills are just, again, organ used to exchange gases underneath water. And as water passes through the mantle cavity, oxygen in the water moves into the blood flowing through the gills. So water comes in through the gills take out the oxygen and move it to the blood, and at the same time CO2 moves in the opposite direction. So as they're taking in the oxygen, they're getting rid of the CO2. And then aquatic mollusks will breathe, wrong way. And then land snails and slugs will breathe or respire using a mantle cavity that has a large surface area lined with blood vessels. So that's just going to be so things can kind of pass in and out very easily, probably through the process of diffusion as well. And for circulation, some mollusks have open circulatory systems and other mollusks have closed circulatory systems. So an open circulatory system, blood is pumped through vessels by a simple heart. And in an open circulatory system, it's also a lot closer to the environment. There's not a lot of veins or anything kind of housing as much as you would see in the opposite, the closed circulatory system. So blood, again, it leaves the vessels and it works its way through different passages called sinuses. So then sinus is just a fancy way to say passage. And then blood passes from the sinuses to the gills where oxygen and CO2 are exchanged. Then blood is then pumped back to the heart. And slow-moving mollusks often have the open circulatory system. And faster-moving mollusks, therefore, will have a closed circulatory system, and that's going to be beneficial because it can transport blood through an animal's body much more quickly than an open circulatory system. So if you're really slow-moving, you don't need your blood to be moving at a high pace as you would if you have a closed circulatory system. So that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions.